What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors comes face to face with a host who refuses to listen? Last night, viewers witnessed something absolutely shocking. A conversation that should have been respectful turned into a complete disaster. In just 33 seconds of pure disrespect, Bill Maher managed to push Samuel L. Jackson to his absolute limit, leading to a walkout that nobody saw coming. Let me take you back to the beginning of last night's episode. The studio lights were bright, the audience was packed, and there was an energy in the room that felt different. Samuel L. Jackson walked onto that stage with his usual cool confidence. He smiled, waved to the crowd, and took his seat across from Bill Maher. The applause was thunderous. This was supposed to be a celebration. Jackson was there to talk about his latest film, his incredible career, and his thoughts on the current state of Hollywood. But within minutes, something felt off. Maher started the interview normally enough. "Samuel, great to have you here. You've been in this business for decades. You've seen it all." Jackson nodded, leaning back in his chair. "Yeah, it's been quite a journey. I'm grateful for every opportunity I've had." The audience clapped. Everything seemed fine. Then Maher shifted gears. "You know, I've been thinking about something," Maher said, that smirk creeping across his face, the one that regular viewers know all too well. Hollywood has changed so much. Everyone's so sensitive now. You can't say anything without someone getting offended. Jackson's expression changed slightly. His smile faded just a bit. "Well, Bill, I think people are just asking for basic respect. That's not really about being sensitive." Maher laughed, not a genuine laugh. One of those dismissive laughs that instantly puts people on edge. "Come on, Samuel. You're telling me you've never felt like people are just looking for things to be mad about?" Jackson straightened up in his chair. "I think people have legitimate concerns. When you've been marginalized for generations, yeah, you're going to speak up about it." The tension in the room was already building. You could feel it through the screen. The audience was quieter now, watching, waiting. Maher pressed on. "But don't you think there's a difference between real issues and just manufactured outrage? I mean, some of this stuff is just ridiculous." Jackson's jaw tightened. "What stuff are you talking about specifically, Bill?" The way he said Bill carried weight. It wasn't friendly anymore. It was a challenge. "Oh, you know," Maher waved his hand dismissively. "All this talk about representation and diversity quotas. Like Hollywood needs to check boxes instead of just hiring the best person for the job." The audience let out a collective gasp. Some people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Jackson stared at Maher for a long moment. "The best person for the job?" he repeated slowly. "That's interesting, Bill, because for decades, the best person for the job always seemed to look exactly the same. Funny how that works." Maher leaned forward. "So you're saying we should hire people based on their skin color instead of their talent?" Jackson's voice rose slightly. "That's not what I said at all, and you know it. What I'm saying is that talent exists everywhere. But if you only look in one place, you're going to miss a whole lot of incredibly talented people." "But that sounds like you're advocating for exactly what I just said," Maher insisted, "making decisions based on race rather than merit." Jackson took a deep breath. You could see him trying to maintain his composure. "Bill, let me explain something to you. When I started in this industry, there were roles I couldn't even audition for. Not because I wasn't talented, not because I wasn't qualified, but because someone decided that certain characters could only be played by white actors. That's not merit. That's discrimination." The audience applauded loudly. Some people stood up. Maher looked annoyed by the response. Okay, he said, trying to talk over the applause. "But we're past that now, aren't we? Things have changed." Jackson shook his head. "Have they? Or do people just like to believe they have because it makes them more comfortable?" Maher's tone shifted. It got sharper, more condescending. "Samuel, you're one of the highest paid actors in the world. You've had an incredible career. Doesn't your success prove that the system works?" Jackson let out a bitter laugh. "My success proves that I was talented enough and lucky enough to break through despite the obstacles. It doesn't mean those obstacles don't still exist for countless others." "But you made it," Maher pushed. "So clearly it's possible." Jackson leaned forward now, matching Maher's energy. "I made it because I was exceptional. I had to be 3 times as good to get half the opportunities. That's not a system that works, Bill. That's a system that fails most people." The room was electric now. Every person was locked in on this exchange. Maher wasn't backing down. I just think we need to stop blaming everything on systemic issues and start talking about personal responsibility. Jackson's eyes widened. Personal responsibility? You want to talk about personal responsibility? Let me tell you about working twice as hard for half the recognition. Let me tell you about being told you're not the right fit for a role that you'd be perfect for. Let me tell you about watching less talented people get opportunities because they knew the right people or looked the right way. Maher interrupted. But that happens to everyone. It's not just a race thing. It's about connections. It's about luck. It's about being in the right place at the right time. Jackson's voice was firm now. And who do you think has better access to those connections, Bill? Who do you think gets to be in the right place at the right time more often? Maher rolled his eyes. Actually rolled his eyes on camera. Here we go again. Everything's about race. Jackson stood up slightly, then sat back down. He was clearly frustrated. No, Bill, not everything is about race. But a lot of things are, and pretending they're not doesn't make you enlightened. It makes you ignorant. The audience erupted in applause again. Maher looked directly at the camera with an exaggerated expression, playing to his bass. See what I mean? Can't have a conversation anymore without being called ignorant. Jackson's voice cut through. I didn't call you ignorant for having a conversation. I called you ignorant for dismissing real experiences that you've never had to live through. Maher turned back to Jackson. All right, let's talk about your experiences then. You grew up in the segregated South, right? Things were actually bad back then. But now, come on. We have laws against discrimination. We've made progress. Jackson nodded slowly. We've made progress. Absolutely. But progress doesn't mean the work is done. Progress doesn't mean we stop fighting for equality. But at what point do we say, enough is enough? Maher asked. At what point do we stop looking at everything through the lens of race? Jackson's response was immediate. When race stops affecting people's opportunities, when race stops determining how you're treated by police, when race stops being a factor in healthcare outcomes, when race stops mattering in people's lives, then we can stop talking about it. Maher shook his head. I just think we're going backwards. All this focus on our differences instead of what unites us. Jackson leaned back. What unites us, Bill, is our humanity. But acknowledging our differences and the different challenges people face because of those differences, that's not divisive. That's honest. Honest, Maher repeated mockingly. Is it honest to say that everything is about race? Is it honest to ignore all the progress we've made? Jackson's patience was visibly wearing thin. I never said everything is about race. But you're sitting here, in your position of privilege, telling me that the issues I'm talking about don't matter. That's not honest. That's dismissive. Maher laughed again, that same condescending laugh. Position of privilege. There it is, the ultimate conversation ender. Just call someone privileged and suddenly their opinion doesn't matter. Jackson shook his head. Your opinion matters, Bill, but so does your awareness of your own blind spots. Having privilege doesn't make you a bad person, but refusing to acknowledge it and how it shapes your perspective, that's a problem. The host crossed his arms. So what you're saying is, because I'm white, I can't have an opinion on these issues? Jackson sighed heavily. That's not what I'm saying, and you know it. You can have an opinion. But maybe, just maybe, you should listen to people who've actually experienced what they're talking about instead of dismissing them. Maher's voice got louder. I'm not dismissing anyone. I'm trying to have a rational conversation. Jackson's voice matched his volume. There's nothing rational about denying people's lived experiences. There's nothing rational about pretending systemic issues don't exist just because they don't affect you personally. The energy was intense now. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. Maher pointed at Jackson. You know what your problem is? You want to be a victim. You've made it to the top of your industry, and you still want to play the victim card. The audience gasped audibly. Several people booed. Jackson stared at Maher in disbelief. Excuse me? Maher doubled down. You heard me. You're successful. You're wealthy. You're famous. But you still want to act like you're oppressed. It's tiresome. Jackson's voice was eerily calm now. Let me make something very clear to you, Bill. Speaking about injustice doesn't make someone a victim. Fighting for others who are still struggling doesn't make someone a victim. What's tiresome is people like you who think that individual success erases systemic problems. People like me, Maher said with a smirk. What does that mean? Jackson leaned forward. People who are comfortable, people who benefit from the way things are, People who don't want to examine how they got to where they are because it might make them uncomfortable. Maher's face reddened. I worked hard for everything I have. Nobody handed me anything. Jackson nodded. I'm sure you did work hard. But you also didn't have to work against a system that was designed to keep you out. You didn't have to prove yourself over and over again just to be seen as competent. You didn't have to be perfect just to be considered good enough. The host threw his hands up. So what do you want from me? What do you want from society? Endless apologies? Reparations? What? Jackson's voice was steady but firm. I want acknowledgement. I want genuine understanding. I want people to stop pretending that just because something doesn't affect them, it doesn't exist. I want the next generation to have an easier path than I did. Maher scoffed. That sounds like a lot of complaining to me. The room went dead silent. Jackson stared at him for a long, heavy moment. Complaining? He repeated quietly. You think fighting for justice is complaining? Maher shrugged. I think at some point, you have to move on. You can't live in the past forever. Jackson stood up slightly in his chair. The past? Bill, this isn't about the past. This is about right now. This is about today. This is about the things that are still happening while you sit here telling me to move on. Maher waved his hand dismissively again. I just think you're making mountains out of molehills. That was it. That was the moment. You could see it in Jackson's eyes. Something shifted. Mountains out of molehills. Jackson said slowly, You think police brutality is a molehill? You think employment discrimination is a molehill? You think the wealth gap is a molehill? Maher interrupted. Those are complex issues that can't just be blamed on racism. Jackson's voice rose. Nobody is just blaming racism. But you can't solve problems you won't acknowledge exist. Maher shot back. And you can't solve problems by making everything about race when it's not. Jackson stood up fully now. You know what, Bill? I came here tonight thinking we could have an actual conversation. I thought maybe you'd listen. Maybe you'd try to understand a perspective different from your own. Maher looked amused. I have listened. I just don't agree with you. Jackson shook his head. No, you haven't listened. You've waited for your turn to talk. You've dismissed everything I've said. You've mocked my experiences and the experiences of millions of people. That's not listening. That's performing. The host leaned back in his chair, that smirk still on his face. So what are you going to do? Walk off my show because I don't agree with you? Jackson stared at him. No, Bill. I'm going to walk off your show because you're disrespectful, because you invited me here just to talk down to me, because you don't actually care about having a conversation. You just wanted someone to argue with so you could feel superior. Maher laughed. Oh, come on. Don't be so dramatic. Jackson started removing his microphone. Dramatic? You think standing up for dignity is dramatic? You think refusing to be disrespected is dramatic? The audience was on the edge of their seats. Some people were already standing. Maher's tone changed slightly. He realized this was actually happening. Samuel, let's just finish the interview. Jackson shook his head as he unclipped the mic pack from his belt. No, I'm done. I'm done with people like you who think your platform gives you the right to belittle others. I'm done with hosts who invite guests on just to insult them. I'm done pretending that this kind of behavior is acceptable in the name of free speech or comedy or whatever excuse you want to use. Maher held up his hands. All right. If you want to leave, leave. But you're proving my point about everyone being too sensitive. Jackson stopped. He turned back to Maher one last time. Sensitive? You think asking for basic human respect is being sensitive? You know what, Bill? That says everything anyone needs to know about you. The audience erupted. Some people were cheering. Others were applauding. A few were shouting support. Jackson walked toward the edge of the stage. Maher called after him. Where are you going? We still have 10 minutes left. Jackson didn't turn around. He just kept walking. Find someone else to disrespect. I'm out. And just like that, Samuel L. Jackson walked off the stage. The cameras followed him as he made his way past the stunned crew members, past the producers who were frantically trying to figure out what to do, past the audience members who were now on their feet. He walked with his head held high, his dignity intact, refusing to participate in a conversation that had stopped being a conversation long ago. Maher sat there, looking at the empty chair across from him. He tried to laugh it off. He made a joke to the audience about sensitivity, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. The audience's response was mixed at best. Some people laughed nervously, others sat in silence, a few walked out themselves. The show cut to commercial early, behind the scenes, chaos erupted. Staff members were arguing, producers were on phones. The remaining guests for the evening were in their dressing rooms, deciding whether they still wanted to appear. The energy in the building had completely changed. When the show came back from commercial, Maher addressed what had happened, but his explanation fell flat. He tried to spin it as Jackson being unable to handle disagreement. He tried to paint himself as the reasonable one, but anyone who had watched that exchange knew the truth. This wasn't about disagreement. This was about disrespect. This was about a host who had crossed a line and a guest who had the courage to walk away. Throughout the rest of the show, Maher kept bringing it up. He made jokes. He defended his position. He acted like Jackson had overreacted, but there was something in his voice, something defensive, something that suggested maybe, deep down, he knew he had gone too far. The remaining segments felt hollow. The other guests seemed uncomfortable. The audience was subdued. In those final moments before Jackson left, everything had crystallized. All the dismissiveness, all the condescension, all the refusal to truly listen. It had built up to a breaking point, and Jackson had made a choice. A choice that resonated with millions of people watching at home who had felt dismissed and disrespected themselves. A choice that said some things are more important than being polite. Some things are more important than finishing an interview. The walkout itself lasted only seconds, but it represented something much larger. It represented the frustration of having your experiences minimized. It represented the exhaustion of explaining basic concepts of respect and dignity to people who refuse to understand. It represented the decision to value yourself enough to remove yourself from situations where you're not valued. Jackson's final words echoed in that studio long after he left. Find someone else to disrespect. I'm out. 7 words that captured everything. The boundary being set, the dignity being maintained, the refusal to accept unacceptable behavior. Those words weren't angry. They weren't shouted. They were calm, resolute, final. As Jackson disappeared from view, leaving behind an empty chair and a host scrambling to maintain control of his show, something had shifted. The power dynamic that Maher had tried so hard to maintain had crumbled, because at the end of the day, respect isn't something you can demand. It's something you earn. And in those minutes of conversation, Maher had shown exactly why he hadn't earned it. The contrast was stark. Jackson had walked onto that stage as a guest, willing to engage in conversation. Maher had approached him as a host, seemingly more interested in scoring points than understanding. Jackson had spoken from experience and emotion. Maher had responded with dismissiveness and mockery. Jackson had asked for acknowledgement and respect. Maher had offered neither. Every attempt Maher made to justify his position only dug the hole deeper. Every time he laughed off Jackson's concerns, he proved Jackson's point. Every time he interrupted or dismissed, he showed exactly the kind of behavior that Jackson was talking about. It was a masterclass in how not to conduct an interview, how not to treat a guest, how not to approach conversations about serious issues. The audience's reactions throughout told the story. The initial applause for Jackson, the gasps at Maher's comments, the uncomfortable silence during the worst moments, the standing ovation as Jackson left. They knew what they were witnessing. They understood the significance of what was happening. This wasn't just a celebrity walking off a talk show. This was a statement about dignity and respect and knowing when to walk away. Jackson's composure throughout was remarkable. Even as his frustration grew, he maintained his articulation. He explained his positions clearly. He gave Maher multiple opportunities to actually engage with what he was saying. He was patient far longer than many people would have been, but patience has limits. And when those limits are reached, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is leave. The empty chair that remained after Jackson left became a symbol of what happens when hosts forget that their platform comes with responsibility, a symbol of what happens when disagreement turns into disrespect, a symbol of what happens when someone values their dignity more than their screen time. That empty chair spoke louder than any words could have. In the studio that night, people would remember where they were when it happened. The exact moment when Samuel L. Jackson stood up, the look on his face as he removed his microphone, the steady determination in his steps as he walked away, the sound of the audience's response. These moments would be replayed and discussed and analyzed for days to come. But in that immediate moment, in that studio, with cameras still rolling and an audience still processing what they had witnessed, the message was clear. Some lines should not be crossed. Some conversations are not worth having if they require you to diminish yourself. Some platforms are not worth being on if the price is your self-respect. Samuel L. Jackson had drawn his line, he had stated his position, and he had walked away with his head held high, leaving behind a host who had learned, perhaps too late, that guests are not obligated to endure disrespect simply because they accepted an invitation to appear.